What is permaculture? It's something I've been drawn to for a long time, and it's more than just farming, a way of managing land. There's a lot more to it. And Ben Falk is the guy that wrote one of the original books that have made an impact over a decade. And here, we're going to learn a lot more about the land side of it, the lifestyle side of it, and some, technological stuff. Been looking forward to this conversation, man. You are one of the OGs in the permaculture. Your book, I think, is about on everybody's shelf if they're interested in, regenerative agriculture and permaculture. So, thank you for taking the time to dive in and help us, understand some more. What is permaculture, Ben?
Sure. Well, I mean, the way I think about permaculture is that it's living in a system and in a way where you are gleaning your livelihood off of the interest rather than the principle from the ecosystem in which you live. Now, permaculture is a broader field than just land management. But to me, the primary way that I use permaculture is through landscape management, which is how most people know permaculture. I mean, you can apply permaculture principles to economics and social systems and all sorts of stuff, businesses. Um, the three ethics of permaculture apply to everything in a lot of ways. But to me, permaculture is a primarily a land design and land management system, and that's how I think of it as living off of the interest. So the ongoing renewable yields that will happen forever as long as we don't screw the system up too badly, rather than mining the principle. So good good way to compare and contrast it is you think about most farming is actually closer to mining. You're reducing the soil organic matter every year. You're reducing the biodiversity. You're reducing the mineral content. So it's a mining operation. It's leaving it more denuded than you found it versus a regenerative operation or a truly sustainable situation where you're just living off of the excess production of sunshine and rainfall and biological activity.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. I hadn't heard the mining comparison, but it makes perfect sense. It's that extraction that makes perfect sense. So you have put out so much work, so much content around teaching people how to implement those things. So
Mhm.
what was the inspiration for doing that? And how long ago was the first book put out?
Yeah, my original book was put out like 11 years ago, and the expanded and revised edition is just literally arriving at people's houses, yesterday, today. It's just came out. And yeah, it's been 10, 11 years in between them. And the first book was, I only that got printed 10 years after I got to this property where I am now, to this site. So it's like, 0 to 10, then report on it, first book, and then year 10 to year 21 is the second book.
So it's basically 20 plus years of your experience and how to within a book that has lots of beautiful pictures. I got my copy in yesterday,
Oh,
so I'm
nice.
one of those ones that got it on the doorstep.
Perfect.
So that's where are you located, and what was that process that you went from, the overview of getting onto the property and to where you are now?
Yeah, I'm right in the middle of Vermont, pretty much, in the Mad River Valley, and we manage another site as well, which is near here. And I just basically got on land at age 25, pretty quickly after college. I went to the University of Vermont, and then I went to worked overseas, well, on an island in the Bahamas, teaching high school, and just was able to put into practice a lot of ideas that I had studied in college, which was ecological design. I took a course with Dr. John Todd. It was a huge inspiration. He's a student at Buckminster Fuller. Like, a lot of this is a multi-generational, lineage to some extent. The kind of first wave of ecological design was like in this country was really, well, the indigenous, obviously the indigenous population, but after that, people like Buckminster Fuller, and then John Todd, Stuart Brand, Jay Baldwin, and that whole wave of people in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then permaculture came along. And so I studied that in college, got super inspired. I was like gonna sleep in a redwood and like protest old growth logging, like very activist oriented. And then I remember reading the first chapter of Mollison's big black book on permaculture, where he says, what are you eating? If you're funding the system with one hand and protesting the system with the other, you're just fighting yourself. And that hit home, because I remember exactly where I was when I read that, and thinking, wow, that's the most kind of grounded thing I had heard at the time. It was easy to just go fight, go be opposed to this and that. Is really still what we tend to promote in this society, versus, create a different system that renders the BS system, the destructive, extractive system, obsolete. That's Buckminster Fuller right there. It's just make a different way that renders the destruction, the Babylon system, obsolete. And so yeah, that inspired me. And then I ended up working at a school in the Bahamas where we're able to allowed to build things and make systems that I would have never been allowed to do in this country until I was, had a engineering license, just because there's no real legality there. There's no codes, and the director just let me and a friend of mine just go nuts. Oh, you got an idea? Make it, build it. So we made all sorts of experimental buildings and permaculture systems, and yeah, just trying to figure out how to make a living there, how to get our basic needs from a very harsh place with as little offsite resources as possible. And then I think that was just super empowering, because we were pretty successful with a lot of things. And then I came back and ended up on land here at age 25. So just got to, I didn't get to learn from a lot of like elders, but I got to make a lot of my mistakes early and often, and, just kind of get into it.
I think permaculture can be a term that it takes some knowledge to kind of understand that. But would you agree that resiliency and some kind of homesteading, even maybe some of the for lack of a better term, prepping kind of worlds are very much in that permaculture realm?
I think sometimes, often they are. I mean, I think there's an inherent permaculture leaning if you're focused on resiliency, which a lot of, I think of prepping as definitely focusing on resiliency. But where I think it's often not permacultural is if it tends to ignore the community context, or ignore the need to be producing, have a garden that's going to give you food, have animals that are going to be part of your food supply in an ongoing way, building soil, slowing, spreading, sinking water, enhancing the health of your ecosystem, your human habitat where you live. If it's not doing that, it's not permaculture. That's safe to say. And a lot of prepping, although I think it's shifting, a lot of prepping conventionally in the United States, at least, has been, store up a whole bunch of guns and ammo, and military rations, or just canned goods, or grains and beans, and just you're going to be ready to live off your stores, which again, that's principle. Then you're going to mine your principle. I'm not opposed to that. I still, I have stores as well. It's important to store up a very important, critical resources. But if you're not focused on also how are you going to produce those things, um, and in a way that's not extractive, then A, it's not going to be good for the long haul, and B, it's not really enhancing the health of your system that you live in, which is, if it's not doing that, it's not really a permaculture approach.
Yeah, it's almost like the whole give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish. You're creating your own food generation through the means that you are. So, Ben, let's talk about the land usage. Let's say it's for we're down in Arkansas, so we've got lots of land. If we were going to take a property, say a 10-acre property, what are the considerations? Say just raw land, wooded raw land. What are the considerations to start that permaculture property?
Mhm.
and principles?
Yeah, well, the biggest foundation point is to look to local knowledge that may be in place, ideally for a very long time. Try to understand how what are the best ways people have lived there for a long period of time. So, looking to both vernacular, like more modern age vernacular systems. How do people live there 100 years ago? How did they live there 200 years ago? um, with less resources, and where did they do that in ways that wasn't super destructive of the living system that's there, which obviously we have a lot of examples of how we did it destructively. But there are pieces, especially in the built environment, like beautiful old barns and systems that people made that lasted a long time. And then also ideally going back before that, and how did people live there? What were their crops? What were their systems 1,000 years ago? And 3,000 years ago, because depending where you are in the world, and most of the world, there there's some information to harvest there. Not always, but oftentimes there were people there, who managed to make a living there for, in some places in the United States, 3, 4,000 plus years. So they learned a lot. Most of it's been forgotten, but we can revive and make use of some of that information where we can get at it. And then the next step is to just be observant the whole time of your system really well, ideally throughout the whole year. As much information and knowledge and experience you have of that place and the particularities of that climate, those soils, and that ecosystem, the better. And then you start working with the system. You start trying to build soil, trying to grow food, trying to make the infrastructure you need. And ideally, you go about it with some reverence of the scale of permanence. So you do the things that are least impactful early on, because you're going to make a lot of mistakes in the beginning. So we like to say, you go out there with a spade rather than a bulldozer right off the bat. Start planting some trees, make some gardens, see how things work. If you go out there right off the bat with the first thing you do is with an excavator, the mistakes you make are going to be bigger than if you start small. So scale of permanence is just a really great system that is a lens through which to look at land as far as how permanent the aspects of the land are. So, for instance, we can change fencing pretty quickly, and plants, the plantscape. Less to far less extent can we change the slope of the ground, so, and the angle and the orientation, the aspect, which way it faces. So those are very permanent. We want to regard those most permanent things first and foremost: slope, aspect, water, climate. Nothing we're going to do on this property is going to change the fact that we live in a zone 4B 5A climate. It gets really cold, it snows, the summers are this warm, nothing we're doing here can adjust that at all. But we can do a lot to adjust, the water system to some extent, definitely the soil, and definitely the plantscape, buildings. Those are all much more adjustable. So we want to regard all our decision making with those things in mind.
The water aspect of land management is really interesting to me, in how we retain water captured. Some areas may not have a lot of rainfall, but they're trying to keep what they've got. How do we look at that through that permaculture lens on these properties?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's safe to say in permaculture, we're always trying to buffer the extremes, right? So the driest times of the year and the wettest. And that comes through creating a lot of different shock absorbing systems, whether it's rainwater harvesting from roofs, rainwater harvesting on the landscape in swales and ponds, rainwater harvesting through building really good soil, high organic matter soil. And then if we're in a really wet place, we also have to get above the water. So we'll often create land shapes like swales, um, or mounds in certain places where we're getting above the really wet areas. So we're trying to basically have a very high diversity of systems, and we're trying to harvest. It's safe to say we're trying to harvest as much water as possible, because there's always, even in very very wet areas of the world, there are dearths. There are times where there's a total lack of water. So we're trying to bank any excess when we can. That goes for fertility, it goes for water, it goes for biological pulses in the system, growth of animals and plants. And we're trying to store those across ideally the year or multiple years. So it's all about like spreading out pulses, harvesting pulses and spreading them out. Water is a good way to see that. And to get a little more specific on that, what we tend to do a lot of is make swales and ponds and store the water from the wet periods into the dry periods, and then we gravity feed or ram pump from those ponds when we need to draw on the water because we're in a dry period.
Really cool. The Talk about that a little more, just the technical aspect of taking the water that's available from the storage and reusing it in the dry times. What kind of systems or irrigation, what does that look like?
Well, the ideal, there's a lot, it looks different with every site, but the ideal situation is you store water high on a property and you can gravity feed from those storages, ponds, tanks, usually is what the form they come in. And then you can gravity feed with either a ditch, like flood irrigation, old school, really primitive, or you can gravity feed with 1 inch or 3/4 inch, poly tubing to the areas you need it. And then you can deliver it and drip irrigate. If it's a veggie garden, you can just run it into a trough, if it's for watering animals. You can run it downhill from a pond and feed a ram pump, and the power of the water can actually drive about a quarter of the water that comes downhill back uphill higher than the water came from. So you can take water from one pond and bring 1,000 gallons, let's say a day, or 100, whatever it may be. Let's say it's 1,000. You bring 1,000 gallons downhill 20 feet, and you can send about 250 uphill 75 feet. So it's almost like a free energy system. It's not, because the cost is water, but that's a water powered pump called a ram pump. That's a really passive, no electricity involved. Some of these things run decades and decades with basically no maintenance way to get water high in the landscape. And then when it's high in the landscape, you can gravity feed it, as I mentioned, to wherever you need it. So we tend to do a bunch with ram pumps, but it's even better if you can store water high to begin with, slow it, spread it, sink it up high, and then gravity feed it directly to where you need it. Now, a lot of systems just go for pumps. Drill a well, pump it. That's fine in a high energy world where you can get parts from all China or wherever you need it to fix the pumps to keep all the electricity flowing, but that's not very resilient. It's not very desirable compared to a much more passive, truly durable, break-proof way of getting water to where you need it. Because water we think of as like so crucial. You want at least 3 different ways of bringing water to your crucial demands. If something's really crucial like food and water, you want to be able to meet that need through not just 1 or 2, but 3, 4, 5 different mechanisms on your site if you're truly interested in serious resiliency.
On the food side of resiliency, Ben, can you give us some examples on how you're able to do that through the various different means? One thing that has always drawn me to the permaculture approach was perennials over annuals. It seems like they have a higher regard or a better fit into the system having perennial plants. So what are a few of these ways of securing a resilient food system?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest way is, as I mentioned before, just diversity, stocking the system with as many different options as possible. So if you don't have a good yield with your potatoes, well, you've got a big Jerusalem artichoke patch, which is kind of another potato. I mean, it's a staple crop, but it's perennial. So like most perennials, it's not going to be as high yielding per area, but it's going to be more durable and it's going to take less work. And it's like a backup, like a, pull the ripcord type of system, total insurance policy where you could have a staple crop without doing anything. We have a bunch of J-choke, Jerusalem artichoke. They call them sunchokes too. A lot of people know about them. We have a bunch of patches and we don't even eat a lot of them, but if we had to, they're there. They're producing every year with like almost no work input. So diversity is a big one. Perennials, as you mentioned, is a big one. Things that don't take a lot of work. I'm looking out at three 50-foot black walnuts that we planted at like 3-4 foot tall out my window. And most years they're producing now hundreds and hundreds of black walnuts without me doing anything. And so that's a backup crop again of high quality fat, high quality protein, the best food source in a lot of ways. And that's just there. So we look at these landscapes as stocking the system with all of these things that are going to produce over a long time, and just get them rolling, roll them out, and the trees are working in the backdrop. Animals to some extent too, but animals often take a lot more, a lot more input. A lot of the backup crop here is wildlife. So we've just established, we've planted thousands of trees and shrubs here, and a lot of those they all feed wildlife, but some of them feed wildlife in a really big way, like nuts, hazelnuts, walnuts, pear, apple, berries. And so we're growing the deer herd here. I could take a deer, if needed, or if I want to, as a result. It's not just think about it. If you take deer and you never improve the ecosystem for the deer, that's more of a mining operation, right? If you've been feeding the deer for 5, 10, 15 years, you're harvesting something you helped make happen. So if you think about it in that way, you can be growing wildlife. You can be tending the wild is a way to think of it. You can be cultivating crops that you didn't necessarily plant, or you don't necessarily own, right? But because they're wild, let's say wildlife, it's all over, it's off your property as well as on your property, but you can be gardening those yields through what you do. And I have 7 different ways in my latest book about that, about how to grow wildlife. But one of the biggest ones is just plant a lot of perennial food crops. I mean, no deer hunter. It's not new to any deer hunter that you can grow a deer food plot with clover and kale and stuff like that. But that's fine. I mean, no, I do that sometimes too. But it's not nearly as cool if you plant hundreds of apples, pears, chestnuts, walnuts, and you're feeding the wildlife for the next hundreds of years, really thousands of years probably, because those will all lead to new trees. You're setting a whole new ecosystem in motion of wildlife production, if you will. So those are some of the ways. But we grow a lot of annuals too. We grow a lot of veggies. Try to grow more than you need. Try to grow for double the amount of people you might have to feed, and then you have extra garlic, extra potatoes, extra onions and shallots. And we focus on storage crops too, because it's very easy to have way more food than you need in August, September, October, November in this cold climate. But then you have 7, 8 more months. So you really need anything that stores is worth, to me, 5 times as much as something that doesn't store.
Well, that makes so much sense, and I love that wildlife angle. I think that's a beautiful way to weave that in there. Um, Ben, is this model economically feasible? Is this a way of running an ag business with the abundance?
Yeah, I think in the current system, the way I think of it economically, being economically advantageous is 2 things. The first is it's a very invigorating, healthy way to live, because you have a lot of high nutrient density food that's heavily mineralized, that's really, really good for you. And you're participating in your landscape intensively. So you're active, you have the way like a trainer I've worked with before talks about is like high volume movement. You're moving all the time. You have a healthy lifestyle, right? So to me, that's incredibly economic, because that's just my landscape is my healthcare provider. If you think about it that way, right? It's invigorating. It's keeping me healthy. So that is obviously more than just economic, but it's also economic to not be sick, not be able to go to the hospital less, whatever it is, be able to have to spend less time and money on dealing with health issues. And then it's really economic in terms of the food that you don't have to buy, the food and medicine that's emerging from where you live, that you grow, that you harvest, some of which you can forage, not just grow actively, that you don't have to buy. But it's much more of a self-sufficiency approach than a surplus approach, right? So it's not like I don't sell a lot of yield. Every time I've sold, I have excess honey, excess mushrooms, plants. Plants a little bit of an exception. I do sell a lot of plants to some extent, and that is very economical. I have a nursery. But whenever I've sold other things like mushrooms and fruit and honey, I'm left with the sense of, wow, that's not actually worth, I don't want that. That money you just gave me for this is like, I can't buy this because this is so high quality. I don't want your $100 for this honey when I can't buy honey this good from the marketplace. So I'm going to keep the honey, keep your $100. I'd rather do what I do for money, for most of my money, which is design, help people choose land, evaluate land, design properties, design landscapes, teach permaculture courses, teach online courses about wood heat and pond design and building and everything else we teach about, and write my book and all of that. So I'd rather do other things for money because, we, truth be told, I don't think we pay, we don't really pay accurately for our food and medicine, that comes from the earth. I think it's about the least proportion of our income that it's ever been in human history right now in the United States. Now in Europe, generally they pay about twice as much for food, but I think food is incredibly undervalued because we've mechanized the system, and it's basically runs on fossil fuel, which is borrowed energy from the past. So we've made it very cheap. But so I don't try to I don't make surplus out of it. I'm not interested in having it be a farming situation as much as it is a homesteading sufficiency situation. You
Yeah,
can
yeah,
you
that's
can do
fair.
that by all means. I mean, that's not my particular angle at it. People do make a living from perennial agriculture. Don't get me wrong. You got to have thousands of that berry or that tree to do that, or that animal. Usually not necessarily thousands of that animal, but usually dozens or hundreds. And I'm more interested in what can I do to produce for my own self and my family.
Yeah, yeah. That again, that makes perfect sense. All about perspective and motivation. So let's go into the wood heat that you have done a great job putting out information around that. So how do you implement the the supply to have wood heat for the water, the cooking, all that? Go into that a little bit because I'm fascinated with how all you do that.
Yeah, well, we basically just we basically we heat our house with 2 cords of wood, and we also get all of our hot water from those 2 cords as well. And we're in a really cold place. I mean, I'm looking outside at a foot of snow, and often we'll have 1 to 3 feet of snow on the ground for 3 to 5 months, a winter. I mean, we're in full on mountains of New England, and much more than even like if you think about a place like Boston, like we're way, way colder. So we're in not as cold as the northern Midwest, like northern Minnesota, North Dakota, much of Montana, but we're colder than pretty much anyone else out there who's listening to this. Or if you're in the Canadian prairies, you're colder than us. But we're in a darn cold climate as far as where people live, and on just 2 cords, we're getting all our winter hot water for 4 to 6 months a year, and we're getting all of our heating. And so that would be $400 if we were buying it. I log our land, and I harvest all the wood that we need, and I cut it up and split it and bring it in to burn it. So I don't spend $200 a cord. But if I was just to buy the wood, it'd be $400. And so that's really cheap. Like your average house around here is not spending $400 on their heat alone. Never mind their hot water. They're spending 2 to 4 or 5 grand, pretty easily in a winter, and that's not even including their hot water. So we do that with just a high efficiency wood cook stove that I arrange copper tubing against the side of it. Is my latest approach. I've done about 4 different primary stoves I've worked on doing this, 4 different versions, and each version I've tweaked like 3 to 10 times. And so I'm on version 4.6 basically. So we'll call it the, 30th, 40th version of these systems. And now I figured out how to do it without actually having to put tubing into the stove. And just by harvesting excess heat from one side of the stove, that thermosiphons hot water rises compared to cold water because it's lighter. So you create a thermosiphon, a convection loop. And so that heat from the stove goes into the water, some of it, not most of it, but let's say 10, 20% of it. Heats up water, that rises into a tank, which is actually on the top floor, second floor of this house. There's actually a third floor, but it goes to the second floor. And it's going up these pipes you see in the background here, right back there, with no pump. And it's banking the heat in a 50-gallon tank, which is up there. And then whenever we open hot water in the sink or in the shower or bathtub or the laundry washing machine, the hot water comes out just like it does in any house. It's really basically the tank knows no difference. The tank is plumbed the way it would be to any other furnace. It just happens to be a wood cook stove, which is, I don't know if it's legit for me to move this around, but it's just this right here. So that's our wood stove. That's the center of our home energy system here. So it's middle of the day. It's only 30 degrees out, so we don't have a fire raging, but that's where the fire goes. I have videos that show how this works, in detail, but you can see where the water comes in here. So that's hot water coming up, and then it's going in here and going into multiple pieces of copper, and then it's coming out here and going up here. And so right now, the water on the hot side is 145 degrees, and it's 145 on the cold side because we haven't used any hot water lately. So that's 50 gallons. That's 50 gallons of 150 degree water, which is a lot of showers, plus a bath or two, plus dishes. So it's more hot water than we need right there. And we're only running the stove right now 6 hours a day because it's pretty warm out. It's like 30 degrees lately. It's been a very mild winter here.
That's absolutely fascinating. So what, help me understand what a cord, how much wood is a cord and what type of wood are you using?
Good question. So a cord is,
or trees.
A cord's 4x4x8 in the United States. 4x4x8 is 128 cubic feet. It's a good amount of wood. I mean, it's like 3,000 pounds of wood dry, good hardwood, 2,500 to 3,500 pounds dry. Down where you are, you could have oak. So it's on the heavy side, and oak is amazing. We don't really have much oak. I've planted hundreds of them, thousands. My son will be able to burn those, but they probably won't be sizable enough for me to want to burn them in my lifetime. But we have a lot of sugar maple, yellow birch, beech, ash, white ash. That's all great firewood. And we mostly burn that wood, burn good hardwood. I'll make kindling out of, softwood, but, we're lucky not to have to burn pine or spruce or fir or aspen, which, is what people are going to be burning out west in the United States or in like Scandinavia. So yeah, we're only 2 cords of that per year.
Ben, do you think that with the efficiency of the stoves and management of the hardwoods, that this is something that could be used at a much, much greater degree?
Yeah, I've always been kind of researching this question, like how many acres, we know what it takes to grow your own food. Your average family, in depending on the climate, obviously not if you're in a desert, but in this climate, a few thousand square feet is going to grow all their veggies they need for a year. Plus, call it 5 to 8 acres if they have a family cow, some chickens, maybe a pig or two. You grow all your own protein and fat on call it 4 to 8 acres of pasture land. These answers are, they vary, but they're pretty clear. But what we don't have very good as good data for is how much acreage does it take to grow your firewood. Now, obviously, the biggest win is the less firewood you need, the better. So the immediately, if you knock down your demand, you need much less land. So it's a huge win to get it down to just 2 cords. Most folks are burning 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 cords, to heat their home in this climate. And then the question is, what's the most effective and efficient way to produce BTUs in the land? For us, that's probably going to be in the form of fuelwood hedgerows of black locust, Robinia pseudoacacia. we are about in year 15, 16, 17, 18 of growing them on this site. We planted the entire northwest and east side of this property. I'm on 10 acres, and we planted, let's say, 500 black locusts on the whole edge of the property. So there's, every 3 to 5 feet, there's a black locust. And they're now in about year 15, getting about this between here and here. And so we're looking at our first harvest. They're quick. I mean, you're not going to harvest an oak tree in year 15 for firewood pretty much. But black locusts grow super fast, and they have as much BTUs. They're as dense as white oak or red oak. But they're actually a little denser than red oak. So they grow as fast as a willow or a poplar, but they're as dense as an oak. So they're a carbon machine. I mean, they grab up carbon out of the atmosphere and get it into lignin and cellulose super densely, super fast. So they're an amazing fast carbon pathway. And so it's a very quick way of harvesting solar energy. I mean, trees are just solar energy. They're more renewable than a solar photovoltaic panel because there's no aluminum and there's no rare earth or anything like that. It's just sunshine and rain and soil biology into harvestable energy,
Yeah.
cellulose and lignin. And so we think the answer to your question that you're getting at there is going to be in the form of like black locust or Osage orange. If you're in your part of the world, Osage orange can be a very quick way to get firewood and really good top end firewood. It's going to be a dense wood that grows quickly. And it's going to be in combination, ideally, with grazing. It's going to be in a silvopasture system. We know that much, but we're just in the first year here of really starting to harvest wood that we planted for firewood. In the past, we've harvested trees that are 30, 40, 50 years old. So they started growing here a while ago. And when it comes to forestry getting firewood, like in a forest system, you're talking about, in this part of the world, the going saying is a cord an acre a year perpetually without denuding the land's ability to keep producing wood. I think that's a bit generous. I mean, I think if if you have a really nice woodland, maybe you're at a cord an acre a year. But I think a lot of the forest in much of the United States is probably going to be closer to like a quarter to 3/4 of a cord per acre per year.
Yeah, too cool. So let's go into the silvopasture aspect a little bit because I know when I have mentioned silvopasture to a lot of people, they look at me like I've got like three heads,
Uh-huh.
and they're like, "What?" And so go into that and what it is and your experience with it and what that could look like with like some different combinations.
Yeah, it's really not as like strange or unusual as it sounds. I mean, anyone who's grazing any animal around trees is doing silvopasture, right? It's not some special sauce. It's just like permaculture. A lot of people are doing different aspects of permaculture and who have never even heard the term. It's nothing. None of these things are brand new, basically. But they're systems that help us understand, some principles and approaches really well. And so silvopasture for us has been grazing sheep among black locust hedgerows. Got some photos of that in my book. It's grazing cows in alleyways where we have thousands of trees planted on contour, and we're grazing the alleys between the trees. So you're getting a lot of benefits because it's great for the animals because even in this climate, which is cold, they want shade. Most animals are going to seek, livestock is going to seek shade in the summer. Even when it's like 65 degrees and sunny, an animal, when given the opportunity, most grazing animals will seek shade. So you're lowering the stress of your animals, which is a healthier animal with less vet bills and less medication inputs. You're also building up the soil faster. Silvopasture is like a holy grail of soil formation. And ultimately, I mean, if we're doing sustainable, regenerative human presence, if we're being regenerative people, we are promoting soil formation, topsoil formation, right? We're building soil. We're not denuding. We're not mining the biological inheritance that is soil. So we always want to be building topsoil and growing plants, growing plants and animals at the same time in synergy is a particularly potent way of building topsoil, especially large grazing animals. People like Abe Collins and Carbon Farmers of America have done a lot of research into this to just see how quickly can you build topsoil. And you remember, trees can actually harvest nutrients and water from deeper down than annual crops. So you're farming at three dimensions of the soil, and as is below, so too is above. You're also harvesting solar energy on a much more three-dimensional way than just growing grass, right? And in drought, you have the immense value of being able to, trees will often keep green leaves into a drought much later and longer than grass stays green. So then you can be cutting trees, we call it tree hay. You can actually be lopping branches off or dropping whole trees to feed your livestock, tree hay. And so I know people who with drought becoming more normal in their area of Western New York, are actually feeding their sheep the last half of the summer. They're really fattening up their sheep on tree hay and forage like leaves, black locust especially, and willow, once the grass browns out and essentially goes dormant for the late part of the summer. So there's all sorts of advantages in this. And the challenges are that it's more management intensive. You got to keep your animals off from destroying your trees, especially when they're young, and that's work. You got to just fence them properly. We fence them off the trees, except in high summer when they're not that interested in chewing on the bark, because like a big cow can destroy, a full on, I mean, cows will destroy a full size tree. If I have 3 to 5 cows at any time, and if I fence cows around even full on mature 200-year-old sugar maples, they have nothing else to do in the winter. They'll just sit there chewing on the tree. They'll kill a full size tree. They'll definitely kill little trees pretty quickly. So you just have to manage their movements a bit more.
On the black locust, are you having a variety that doesn't have the thorns? Or are you just dealing with thorns, or what's that look like?
Yeah, no, they all have thorns, and that's a nice thing actually for grazing management, because it keeps it keeps the animals off the trees a bit. So like seaberry, I like for that too. It's what I think of as a grazable plant, right? Because the grazing animals aren't going to just destroy them really quickly. So I like thorny stuff in silvopasture actually. Um, but yeah, ours have thorns, and they're super fast growing. They're amazing. I mean, they're amazing honey tree too. They say you can make more honey on an acre of black locust than any other plant. Now I'm sure that's not always the case.
Sure.
Basswood's pretty amazing. Clover's pretty good. But they are top grade honey forage tree. And they say they really think of them as native from your part of the world. If you look up black locust, a lot of people will cite Arkansas, the Ozarks, as being like the epicenter of black locust emergence in the world.
Yeah. I think, yeah, we've got them all over, and I know they burn so good and hot, and for a long time. I was thinking back to one of my best friends is in West Fork, so Northwest Arkansas, and he has the Osage orange out there, and he absolutely hates them. He is, the big
Yeah,
apples,
thorn apples.
they're there. Oh, so I was just thinking about trying to get Clay to, we need to plant more Osage orange, but I love what you did. And that is such a beautiful wood.
Yeah,
It is gorgeous.
it's
So
it's
what,
considered the
what
best
else?
bow making wood for boyers on the planet by many.
It's so pretty. What else can we do, to incorporate more of this natural, tree utilization on properties like that? I love everything
Yeah.
you're saying.
Well,
Is there anything else that stands out?
I mean, it just totally depends on your site, right? If you have a lot of space, plant a lot of trees is usually a good idea. If you're not on much room, if you're on an acre and I would say, well, be careful where you plant trees. Plant trees to the north of your house or to the north of your garden. Don't shade out. You don't want to shade your garden. Most anywhere in the world, you need full sun in your garden. So, I mean, that's the big downside with trees is you do end up with a lot of shade. So you just got to be careful with what you're going to shade out. Oftentimes, it's a no-brainer to plant the whole property boundary with trees. That's a good starting place. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people. More often than not, when I do online consults or site consults in person, that's almost always a recommendation. Hey, you got a boundary there with the next landowner, and it's just field. Do you want to see them? Do they want to see you? Do you want wind blowing through there? You might as well plant that edge. That's low hanging fruit, is just planting your boundary oftentimes, or planting to the north side of the property. Um, but yeah, everything else, really varies by site to site. But, there's a lot of great fruit, a lot of great berries that are, I think of a lot of the tree and berry crops as like your medicine cabinet, along with the herbs, as like a backdrop, nutraceutical quality, your medicine, planting your medicine, growing your medicine. I said in my first book, it's going to be potentially much more difficult to stay healthy in the future than to stay fed. Like, staying fed's one thing, staying healthy, good luck with that, with what's going on in the world. So that's proven more true, in way more true since I wrote those words 11 years ago. I mean, I wish it wasn't true, but it is unfortunately getting, as you've done a lot of work on this, it's getting more and more challenging just to stay healthy. And I think about a lot of the tree and berry crops, along again with the herbs and the animal crops too, more so. I mean, I've moved into more ancestral, high fat, high protein eating over the last handful of years, especially, than I used to be aware of. But those are all, like health sustaining crops, even if they're not, a staple crop, like calorie wise.
Uh, I agree wholeheartedly. There was a time, early on in our cancer journey where I was like, "Oh my goodness, meat causes cancer." All these terrible things, and I've completely flipped as we've been able to, talk to experts and look at things objectively and not have these beliefs going into and just trying to learn. And the ancestral aspects make way too much sense. That we've been eating that a long time. But
The old
Ben,
quote, I trust cows more than chemists, when it comes to, you're going to eat butter or margarine.
yeah,
We could have avoided that whole
yeah,
thing with just that basic realization. Would you trust a cow or a chemist more?
that's beautiful. That's got to be a T-shirt if it's not already.
Hey, put it on
That's
one.
we we just wrapped up an interview going into the fats and the damages of vegetable oils and how much we were misled over the saturated fat demonization era.
Mm.
But I digress in that, but what we eat matters so much, and the lifestyle. That's why I really wanted to get with you because I love what you're doing. I think the sea berry topics were so interesting. That's something that I'm going to order from you. But if somebody wants to learn more, Ben, how do you suggest they do it? And do you work with people? If say somebody has a property and they want some permaculture design or consultation, how do they reach out?
hmm Yeah, I mean, with one of the great things about being able to do and doing what we're doing right now is I can help people much further distances than I did in the first 10 years of my career. I do a lot of Zoom online consults, helping people evaluate land, evaluate property that they are thinking of buying. That's probably the most value dense thing I can provide, because those are major decisions. Well, probably often the biggest decision you'll make in your life, besides who you spend your time with and who's your partner, if you have one, is what's your land, who's your land, where's your human habitat. So I do a lot of that, and then we help people in my business. We design landscapes too, and do site planning. Have landscape architects and architect on staff, and yeah, and then we teach courses about it as well. So that's, yeah, I spend a lot of my time doing that, and but as much of my time as possible on the land, actually doing the work itself.
I I think that's why I appreciate what you do so much is you're not just writing at it in an office. You're living it. You're doing it. And so just I definitely appreciate your work and everything you put out. Cannot recommend your books enough. I have not been able again, I just got it yesterday to go through the new revised version, but the first one was I mean that's a classic.
Thanks. I appreciate you saying that. I think that the second one it's much more mature. A lot. Continued to learn a lot in the last 11 years versus the first 10 years.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time. Can't wait to, dive in more of what you've done and just appreciate your friendship and all of it.
Hey, well, thank you. I appreciate what you're doing out there too. I still want to listen to dig into the past podcasts you've done, and what you're putting out there is incredibly valuable. It's great to see the world waking up to, you know, all of the wisdom that's already out there.
Amen. Amen. All right. One more thing. I wanted to get your take on it.
Yeah.
What does prosperity mean to you?
I think having the best life for the longest period possible, ideally many generations, would be what comes to mind when I think of prosperity off the bat.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, Ben, thank you again, my friend.
Thank you. Appreciate your time, man.
Thank you for joining us on Sowing Prosperity. Be sure to follow along across the social media platforms, including YouTube, and be sure to go to sowingprosperity.com.